Welcome back. We've now officially crossed the threshold, and we are less than a year out from next year's presidential election. And that coincided this week with the latest numbers from the Marquette Law School poll, taking the temperature of Wisconsin voters. And here to break down those numbers is poll director Charles Franklin. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So I want to ask about those first top-line numbers. Trump and Biden are essentially neck and neck within the margin of error. Is that what we've seen so far since we've had that poll in June?
Well, in June, we saw Biden actually quite a ways ahead, but that was more than we would have expected in a Wisconsin midterm or a presidential election. This looks much more like the kinds of presidential elections we're used to that are decided by less than a percentage point. Here we have a 2-point margin, but the margin of error is 4.5. So the right way to think about that is this is a toss-up race. Likewise, DeSantis has a 2-point lead over Biden, but that's the same 2 points inside the margin of error. Both of those look like toss-ups.
And so we always talk about this being just a snapshot in time. How much do these poll numbers move kind of in the next 12 months here?
Sure. Well, that's the big question. You know, a movie is made up of a whole lot of still pictures that you stitch together. And that's exactly what the snapshot in time of a poll is. This is where we are today. Then we'll be back with another poll in January. Where are we then? How's it moved? Then where are we in March? Where are we in June? And so on. Look at those over the next 12 months to see whether the images of the candidates have shifted, whether their strengths or weaknesses have changed, and of course, whether the horse race has changed over that time. The reason to do polling today is not because we think it's where the race will turn out, but it's so that we understand where we've been and then how we move over this next 12 months, assuming we move at all, which is another possibility.
Certainly. So your poll was conducted before this latest GOP debate, and we're seeing the Republican field start to narrow a little bit. What does that look like here in Wisconsin?
It's narrowed quite a bit. We really have 3 people over 10% in the GOP side of the primary poll. Donald Trump at 38 is 20 points ahead of Ron DeSantis, who in turn is 7 points ahead of Nikki Haley. But something has changed there. Since June, Haley has gone from 3% to 11, an 8-point rise, and DeSantis has fallen by 12 points, while Trump has gained 7. So that's not inconsistent. In fact, that's very consistent with national polling that's been showing DeSantis declining for a number of months now, Trump rising a bit, and Nikki Haley rising out of those mid-single digits that she was in before. No other Republican candidate is more than 3% in this poll.
So the one candidate that we didn't get to earlier in the head-to-head was Nikki Haley, and she beats Biden by some 9 points.
9 points,
in
yes.
Wisconsin. What contributes to that? Because she's not, ahead in the GOP polls. Is that independence?
No, I think what it's partly is independence, but it's also that a lot of people, 33% in this poll, say they don't know enough about her to have an opinion. And that includes quite a few Republicans without an opinion of her. She's also not got the same image that Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis have. People are both more vague about what her positions are, but they don't associate her with Trump in the same way that DeSantis also draws some of that Trumpier attitudes. So I think what's going on with Haley is that she's a kind of neutral enough Republican that people with doubts about Joe Biden can express maybe they would go for her, whereas people have such strong opinions about Donald Trump, both pro and con, that none of that really works. So a quick example, when we look at how people say they voted in 2020 and how they're voting now, in a Trump-Biden matchup, it's 95% of Trump's people stay with him, 94% of Biden stay with him. But when we go to Haley, she actually pulls off 15% from Biden voters in 2020. Now, that doesn't mean 12 months from now, if she's the nominee, that she will get such a strong performance. But it's a good illustration about how some prior Biden voters now have qualms. And if you give them a Republican that they don't know as much about and that doesn't elicit the same kind of opposition reflexes, that a Republican could do better against Biden. But again, not a forecast for where we would go. If she were to emerge, we'd want to watch how those opinions change over the next year.
And is that unique to her? Do we see that effect with DeSantis, for example?
No, we don't. And DeSantis is closer to Trump in the way people react. Now, he does lead Biden by 2, so he does do a little bit better. And the biggest difference is the one you mentioned. DeSantis draws more independents, whereas independents are evenly split between Biden and Trump. But also Nikki Haley likewise draws much stronger independent support than the Trump-Biden case.
So I want to look at Wisconsin specifically. We've seen a lot of turnover on the state Supreme Court this August. It flipped the balance for liberals for the first time in more than a decade. You asked about the Supreme Court job approval numbers, and it's net positive. It's the first time I remember seeing that in one of your polls in a while. How does that stack up historically?
Yes, we've actually never asked about the Supreme Court before, but as the court has become more involved in politics, people pay more attention to it. We've now added so that we cover all 3 branches of government: the governor, which we've always asked, the legislature, which we've only asked about from time to time, and now for the first time, the court. But going forward, my intention is to ask about all 3 of those so we see how that plays out in this same way over the coming year. Do attitudes shift towards any of those 3 branches?
I was going to ask too, kind of going down the list, state legislature, net negative, governor, certainly it's a person though at the same time, net positive. Is that an indication of the party that's controlling those institutions?
Well, somewhat, but there's been a little bit of a shift from that. The legislature had a stronger rating back in 2022 when we previously asked the question. You know, we've gone through a budget cycle and the usual conflict between the governor and the legislature. The governor's approval is down a few points, 3 points from where it was in June, but is still over 50% approval. The legislature, though, is down around 40% approval, and the Supreme Court about 51% approval. So governor highest ratings, followed closely by the court, with the legislature down a bit.
And you also asked on the issue of impeachment, just how much people are aware of it. 31% say that they know a lot, 39% say that they know a little, 29% nothing at all. How does that stack up against like other issues that we see that are prevalent?
Yeah, there are a lot of issues that those of us that are around the Capitol a lot or follow politics really closely think should be household conversation. But we really find that a lot of those issues don't penetrate to the broader public who aren't as obsessed with capital things as we are. What did stand out on the impeachment question is that Democrats were more than twice as likely to say they'd heard a lot about impeachment than Republicans are. So that raises a question of, if this was on the Republican side about messaging to your constituents, doesn't look like the message got through very well. On the Democratic side, they actually did do advertising and campaigning on, or ads anyway, on impeachment, and it does sure look like their voters got more of that message, though still it wasn't universally known.
And so you changed your methodology for this poll a little bit, 900 voters, which I think is a little bit more than you usually do, and a mix of a voter registration list and this opinion panel. Kind of curious why you did that. Will this fix some of the issues that we saw in 2016?
Well, this is the, the issue of how many people don't want to answer their telephone when it rings during dinner, or even not during dinner for that matter. And so the whole polling industry has shifted to this newer methodology. We use the voter list, and the company that we work with matches the voter list to email addresses and phone numbers so we can contact people from the voter list. And for those people, we send an email invitation and a text invitation to do the survey online. And if we don't hear back from them, then we call their telephone, including their cell phones, of course. The other part of the interviews are based on an address-based sample where a random sample of mailing addresses is drawn in the state, and then people are contacted by letter with an invitation to take part in polls over the next couple of years. And they do repeated polls, not just for us, but for others. But they've agreed in advance to be polled, so therefore it's a much higher response rate when we go back to them for our poll.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Poll Director Charles Franklin, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.